Welcome to today's webinar, Replenish, Supporting the Virtuous Cycle of Water and Prosperity, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter for smart growth and planning news, and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Replenish, Supporting the Virtuous Cycle of Water and Prosperity. You can also search for event number 921-3873. I'd also like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So to get started today, our speaker is Sandra Postel. Sandra directs the Global Water Policy Project and lectures, writes, and consults on global water issues. She focuses on bridging science, policy, and practice in discovering innovative ways of securing water to meet both human and ecosystem needs. From 2009 to 2015, Sandra served as the Freshwater Fellow of the National Geographic Society, where she led the creation of a water stewardship initiative that has restored billions of gallons of water to depleted rivers and wetlands across North America. Her work has appeared in Science, Natural History, Ecological Applications, and many other publications. She appeared in the BBC's Planet Earth, Leonardo DiCaprio's The 11th Hour, and the National Geographic's Breakthrough series. Her award-winning book, Last Oasis, served as the basis for a PBS documentary. And just last week, Sandra was awarded the Stockholm Water Prize for her long and outstanding work to make sense of complex water-related issues. Following her presentation, Sandra will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And today, as we often do, we're going to take a quick poll to find out where everyone is joining us from. If you're unable to respond by clicking on the poll, you may need to leave full screen mode. We'll just leave this open for a few seconds so you can have a chance to respond. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. You can see the responses coming in. We'll just leave it open for another 15 seconds or so, just to give everybody in the audience a sense of where people are from, and to give Sandra as well a little taste of that. And then we'll turn it over to her to begin. Great. So today's audience, 34% is in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 21% in the West, 19% in the Midwest and South, and 7% of our audience today is international. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Sandra. Welcome, Sandra.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate that introduction very, very much. And thank you all for joining. It sounds like we have a great distribution across the country, and I'm excited to share some ideas with you. I also wanted to thank Jen Hawes of Island Press for helping organize this. Island has been a great publisher for me to work with, and just thrilled to to be here with you today. Jen and I thought it would be great to put this first slide up. Are you seeing it? Okay.
Yes,
it's up. Good. Just to let you know that you can plug in the code SMART at islandpress.org and get 30% off on my book, which Island Press arranged for today. So thank you again.
Hey, Sandra, just before you go, could you go into full slideshow?
Sure. Sorry. Yep. Okay, there we go. Does that work? Okay. So what I'd like to do today is, kind of give the 30,000-foot view of what our water challenges are, present kind of the big picture of what's confronting the globe and the U.S., and try to do that fairly rapidly in 15 slides so that we have a lot of time remaining to look at solutions. And I have to apologize for not being able to share the deck of slides afterwards. Some of the photos you'll see are proprietary, so I have the ability to use them but not to share them. So take a good look while you have them, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have after that. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so please gather them, as we go through. I'm going to start with the most fundamental thing about water here. Just trying to move this out of the way. And that is that we live on an incredibly water-rich planet. But less than 1% of all the blue that you're seeing on this slide is both fresh water and water that's accessible to us. So we have this sense that we have this abundance, but it is, in terms of what's fresh and available, it's a very small share of all the water on Earth. And the important thing too is to realize it's finite. That was one of the most important things we got from this picture the astronauts took in 1968. We could see this very beautiful but vulnerable planet out in space and see that it's finite. The water is finite. It's confusing because we have this renewable water cycle, but it's in a finite amount. And so as demands have grown with population and economic growth, we've come into a situation where we have an increasing amount of global water depletion around the globe. When I first started working on water issues, maybe 40 years ago now, this map would not have appeared nearly so red. This is looking at the water available in relation to how much we're using, and it's gotten redder and redder and redder with each passing year. This map was the result of a study that I did with a number of colleagues a few years ago, published in Elementa, if you wanted to get into more detail about it. But the key thing is to look at the red. The very deep red is where generally we're depleting groundwater in a chronic sort of way. The lighter red is where we see significant seasonal depletion. So that's, as you can see, virtually all of the Western US, much of Northern Africa, parts of China, most of India, most of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf area, and so on. So these are areas that are struggling with water shortage on a seasonal basis, and that seems to be getting longer and longer in many cases. And then we have drought year depletion, which is also very, very common. But overall, it's a disconcerting picture because it suggested, based on our analysis, that 70% of irrigated agriculture in the world, which generally provides 40% of the world's food supply, and nearly half of large cities are experiencing at least periodic water shortage. And some much more than that. If you think about Jakarta in Indonesia, Mexico City, where chronic groundwater depletion is a big threat to the security of the whole drinking water supply. So keep this map, if you can, kind of in mind as we go through it. And we do see the manifestations of this on the ground. You know, major rivers are no longer reaching the sea, right? This is the Colorado Delta in Mexico. This is the tail end of the Colorado River, which supplies 7 states in the US, but no longer reaches the sea. And what had been a 2 million acre, beautiful, wildlife-rich wetland is now virtually a desiccated desert-like place. Think about the Nile, think about the Yellow River, the Murray in Australia. What else? The Ganges, you know, major rivers that are no longer reaching the sea because of excessive depletion upstream. I mentioned groundwater depletion, and this is a very important statistic, that about 10% of the global food supply depends on the overpumping of groundwater, the unsustainable use of groundwater. So that's, you can think of that as kind of a bubble in the food economy, right? You can't do something that's unsustainable indefinitely. And so we're going to have to reckon with the fact that 10% of our food is coming from the unsustainable use of groundwater. In effect, we're using some of tomorrow's water to meet today's demands. Well, what about the food demands for tomorrow? How are we going to meet that? So this is sort of an out of sight, out of mind problem, but a very, very significant one. I think of the groundwater depletion issue as sort of the tiger in the room, right? We can't see it, but it's there. We have been extraordinarily successful, you know, in bringing rivers under control, so to speak, through the construction of dams globally. We now have about 60,000 large dams, and the dam industry defines a large dam as one that's at least 45 feet or higher, roughly, right? And so about 60,000 of those, and tremendous benefits from that: hydropower, water supply, flood control, irrigation, recreation. But at the same time, as you can see here, the iconic Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, which was the first big super dam completed in the 1930s, these dams totally disrupt the natural flow of rivers. Okay, and we're going to come back to that a little bit. So enormous benefits, but increasingly high costs when we see what it's doing to the life in the river, to the health of the river, and all the services, natural services that we get from a healthy river system. At this point, we've lost up to 50% of the world's wetlands, okay? And as they go, so go what we call wetland services, the ecosystem services, right, that wetlands provide. And look at the list on the right-hand side of the slide. Removal of pollutants, nitrogen and phosphorus, regulating floods. You know, wetlands are like a sponge. They absorb flood water, they absorb water in general, can absorb flood water and hold it, store it, and release it gradually, just like a sponge would do. Creates terrific bird and wildlife habitat, great for fishery production, sequesters carbon, so they're very important for mitigating climate change and mitigating drought, because if you're storing that water over a longer time, you're ready for the next dry year, right? So the disappearance of wetlands has created a lot of trouble for the water cycle and for our ability to cleanse water, store water, and become more resilient, right, to droughts and floods. We have seen in my lifetime tremendous benefits in water quality, improvements in water quality. If you think about, you know, the way the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland, Ohio caught fire a number of times in the 50s and 60s, that doesn't happen. I was standing alongside the Cuyahoga River, I think it was 2 years ago. Beautiful river, right? There's recreation on it, boats, people enjoying the river as a recreational place to go. But we have a growing problem in the form of non-point source pollution. If you go back to when the EPA was created in 1970, about 85% of the pollutants going into rivers was coming from what we call point sources, right? Wastewater treatment plants, industrial factories. And 15% was coming from the non-point sources, agriculture and septic systems and so on. Now that's reversed, and that's in part because we've done such a good job of controlling the pollution from point sources. But now we have 85% of the pollutants coming from non-point sources, farms, septic systems, and so on. And this really caught a lot of people's attention in 2014 during the summer, when the western side of Lake Erie got a huge algal bloom in it from the influx of nitrogen and phosphorus, largely from farm fields in Ohio and in the neighboring states. And it settled right over the intake for Toledo, Ohio's drinking water system. And it turned out that there was a toxic microorganism called microcystin in this algal bloom that made that drinking water hazardous to drink. So here you've got a city of millions of people where the drinking water is suddenly not safe to drink. So Toledo had to put out a notice: don't give this water to your pets, don't drink this water, don't cook with this water, and had to shut down the intake until it could get resolved. So this was a fairly dramatic and important wake up that these algal blooms being on the rise is a growing problem, and we see it in many parts of the world now. We see it along the eastern coast. We have had emergencies in Florida. I grew up on Long Island, as we'll see in a little bit later. It's a big problem on Long Island. There in the Chesapeake Bay area, it's a big problem. So this is a growing problem. And what you also have is this creation of dead zones from the excess nitrogen and phosphorus flowing into rivers and creeks and then on out to the coastal zones. So we have at this point more than 400 dead zones of significance worldwide, and they've been growing significantly. We've seen the number of dead zones, again, this is worldwide, roughly double each decade since the 1960s. So again, we've made great strides in reducing pollution, but these increases in toxic algal blooms and dead zones is a growing concern. And of course, this affects fisheries, coastal fisheries, it affects property values, it affects jobs, it affects recreation. So this is of increasing concern. We hear a lot about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico every year, variously the size of New Jersey, New Hampshire, depending on what's happening in the Gulf that year, but it's always there, and we haven't yet been able to bring it under control. Here's a statistic that I personally have a hard time wrapping my head around. This came out of the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index in 2018. And what this study found is that freshwater life is fairly rapidly disappearing. We're talking about life here, not species, okay? Just the numbers of things. So since 1970, the average abundance of freshwater vertebrate populations worldwide has declined 83%. And you can think about that in another way, where 50 years ago, for every 100 frogs and fish that were around then, there are now only 17, right? I have a hard time grasping that we've lost that much freshwater life in 50 years, a twinkling of an eye. This is one of my colleagues. He was a Nat Geo explorer also. Zeb Hogan, who's holding a Mississippi paddlefish, one of the species that's also at risk. This is in the Missouri River system. So in addition to, we all know we're losing species at an alarming rate, but these are abundance, the numbers of things out there. So this is a kind of a statistic, if you will, to sort of focus on a little bit and what this really means. So here we go. All of the things we've been talking about up to now are happening anyway, right? They would be happening in the absence of climate change. These are long-term trends that have been growing. But with climate change now, these trends are worsening, and they're poised to worsen more. Okay, I know this is bad news. We're going to move into solutions soon, but it's important to grasp the moment we're in. So all the things we've been talking about, floods and droughts. Now let me just back up. So when you look at the temperature index there, you see that rise that's been occurring for some decades now. And the reason we're going to experience climate change primarily through the water cycle is that as the atmosphere warms, it expands, which means it can hold more moisture. And so as a rule of thumb, areas that are wet are going to get wetter. Areas that are dry are going to get drier because that evaporative demand of the atmosphere is going to increase. So if you're in a wet area, you're going to pull more air into the atmosphere, which means you can get more intense rainfall. If you're in a dry area, you're going to pull more water up out of the soil, out of rivers and reservoirs, and so you're going to get drier. And so this is a big concern. Water shortages, melting glaciers, algal blooms, algae like to expand in warmer water. So as the water's warm, we'll get more blooms, more dead zones. I didn't talk about wildfires. I often do, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. They're increasing as well, and that has implications for drinking water quality, sea level rise, and extinction. So about 13 years ago, a group of scientists, hydrologists, water scientists, published a piece in the journal Science, and they titled it, "Stationarity is Dead." And for planners, for water managers, for state, local officials, this is a very big deal. What this phrase means is essentially, you know, the past is no longer a good guide to the future. We're outside, you know, we're accustomed, if we're involved in water in any way, we know that there's a lot of variability, right? There's going to be a drought, there's going to be a flood. There's a lot of natural variability in hydrologic systems. But what these scientists were saying in the phrase "stationarity is dead" is that we're outside that envelope of what is normal, right? So it means that the droughts are going to be more severe, the floods are going to be more severe. We're outside the envelope. And if you're a planner or a water manager, this is very, very difficult to deal with. How do you know if a levee, you know, so many feet high is going to be sufficient to control the flood? How do you know if the reservoir is really going to refill if you're in a place that's getting drier? How do you know if the dam is going to hold if you're in a place where the floods and the rainfall intensity is getting so much greater? It's very hard to plan with confidence. And so this is a tough time for planners. And of course, with infrastructure, you're always thinking out, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on what you're building. So this is tough. This is really tough information. And it's no longer theoretical. We got a very big wake-up call to the implications of all of this in 2018 when Cape Town, South Africa began announcing what it called Day Zero, which was the day that the taps were going to be shut off for the roughly, I think it's 4 million people or so that live in Cape Town. This is a picture of one of Cape Town's largest reservoirs in March of 2018, virtually completely dry. And they realized they were no longer going to be able to supply the residents of Cape Town with drinking water. And so they kept announcing Day Zero, and they kept moving it back. You know, initially it was very hard to get the public mobilized to conserve. Then they began to, and then they began, as things got worse, to buy some water from farmers that were willing to sell it. So they got through, but it was like, I think starting in February, such a day was going to be the day the taps went dry. And they started, you know, developing stations around Cape Town where people would have to go to get just enough water to get them through the week or whatever. as luck would have it, conservation on an emergency sort of way, buying some water from farmers, and then the rains came just in time. So it didn't happen, but they were on, just on the brink of what would have been a very, very significant event in the course of a major modern city. And so it was a wake up for water utility folks everywhere that this could happen. And the thing that we learned later, there's this relatively new field called attribution science. How much of an event like this can we attribute to climate change and the implications of climate change? We haven't been able to say very often how much of why an event happened was due to climate change or just natural causes. We're getting better at this through this science of attribution. And what the scientists found is that the probability of this drought scenario in Cape Town happening had tripled due to climate change. There was a drought one year, then it happened another year, and then there was a third year of drought. That had not really been seen before. So the probability of this drought scenario had tripled as a result of climate change. And Cape Town had really no backup. It couldn't turn to groundwater. It didn't have desalination. So it had no resilience in a sense to deal with this other than to warn people that your taps are going to go up. So this is an interesting story, a case study that has taught us a lot of things. But it shows too that we're in this new normal, right? We've got to think and plan differently. Last year here in the US was an extraordinary year. We broke the US record for billion-dollar climate and weather events with 22 of them. It was the 6th consecutive year of 10 or more billion-dollar events. And again, they're mostly water-related events. We have hurricanes, we have a lot of severe weather events, we have wildfire, which again affects drinking water. And these are interesting to study in and of themselves. And then you look at a graph like this at the cost of these billion-dollar events between 1980 and 2020. And it's interesting that you can see what the record breaker is so far is 2017. And if you remember what we had happening in 2017 were 3 enormous hurricanes, right? We had Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Louisiana. We had Hurricane Irma in Florida, and we had Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, all happening at once. We had wildfires in California, and then a smattering of, drought, hailstorms, tornadoes, and other events. But over $320 billion that year in weather and climate related events. And it looks like an outlier, right? It looks so far above the norm, the little gray, maybe I can show it right here, the little gray lines here that all converge. This looks like a huge outlier, but the latest National Climate Assessment, US National Climate Assessment, says that we should expect this kind of thing by the end of the century. We should be expecting weather and climate events on this order by the end of the century. This one, by the way, the second year was 2005, which was Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. So this is a wake up too, right? That we can expect more of these events, more costly events, and they're coming down the pike. So what do we do about this? And I often think about this very, very wise statement by Albert Einstein. That we cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. It's tempting when you're having a water shortage or a drought to do what you did before, but do it bigger, do it faster, right? Build a big new dam, build a big new reservoir. Do what you were doing, what's familiar as a solution, but do it bigger. And I think what Einstein is suggesting, and what my research has certainly shown, is that that's really not going to serve us going forward. That's not the way we're going to become more secure with water, more resilient to climate change in the future. What really is happening is that all of the solutions that have brought this prosperity to date I should say not all of them, most of them have involved sort of bending the natural water cycle to our will, right? It's hard to imagine, I think, cities like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, without big water engineering. We wouldn't really have them. So they've created a lot of prosperity, but they've also broken the water cycle. And what we need to do going forward is figure out how to have prosperity, but repair the water cycle in the process. Damaging it further is not going to serve us. And so I began researching Replenish with that question in mind. How can we have prosperity, meet human needs for water and nature's needs for water, while repairing and replenishing the water cycle? So I want to talk a little bit about that, some of the things we can do that are not going to cause more harm, but actually allow nature and ecosystems to thrive and economic prosperity to thrive as well. So one thing we have been doing for quite some time, but especially more over the last 20 years, is removing dams that are no longer serving a useful purpose. We've had in this country nearly 1,500 dams dismantled over the last 30 years. Most of them are relatively small. The old textile mill dams in New England and Pennsylvania that have come down. Many of them are no longer in use. Many of them are no longer safe. And so from a safety and practicality standpoint, it makes sense to take them down and is often cheaper than repairing them, right? So we've had a lot of dams come down, but the good thing is there's no particular economic loss in many cases, but it's of great benefit to the river. This is an image of a fairly large dam on the Elwha River in Washington State, Glines Canyon Dam, which came down a few years ago along with its partner dam, the Elwha Dam. And it's amazing to have watched what happened. Here's a picture of the reservoir that had been created by the dam and the river starting to reclaim its channel, right, as it flows through the dam, through the reservoir site. And then within months of the dam coming down, scientists were counting 4,000, more than 4,000 spawning Chinook salmon above the former dam site. And we've seen this time and again with dams coming down. One of the first early big ones was in 1999, the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Maine. And after that dam came down within years, we had alewife and I think salmon and a number of other important species in that system coming back. So it's a great example that if you give nature a chance, in a sense, it will heal. Rivers will heal. Life will come back. And that's a very positive message that, we may have seen this diminishment in fish populations for a variety of reasons, but they can come back. Give it a chance. And so we're seeing that in these instances. One of the things I focused a lot on in the book is how just simply getting smarter, right, about how we're using and managing water can make such a big difference, especially when we then take the savings from that, getting smarter about how we use and manage water, and return some water to depleted ecosystems. There's tremendous opportunity in this area. And I'm just going to give you one example on the Verde River in Arizona. This is a beautiful river system that's part of the Colorado River Basin. Begins in kind of north central Arizona. It is, as it flows south, it becomes a drinking water supply for Phoenix, flows on down, joins the Salt River, joins the Colorado as it continues on down toward Mexico. It's one of those few rivers that is still has a very nice riparian, riverside forest, which is really essential for the migratory birds and fish and wildlife among the desert rivers in the Southwest. But as is typical with many river systems in the Southwest, in the West in general, I would say, is that it's nearly tapped out for irrigation during the dry season. There's a century-and-a-half-year-old irrigation ditch system adjacent to the river in the river valley that basically takes all the water out of this river for months at a time during the dry season, during the irrigation season. And so 5 to 8 miles of the river would often be dry. during that irrigation season. And again, there was no particular reason for irrigators to do anything different. They were doing nothing wrong, certainly nothing illegal, just that they had no real way to know exactly how much water they would need. So they would take it all out of the river, right, and irrigate their land. Working with conservation groups, in this case, the Nature Conservancy, and I want to emphasize that, you know, there's not always been a great relationship between irrigators and conservation organizations. So the Nature Conservancy hydrologist Kim Schoenig, who came into this valley charged with trying to protect the ecosystem values of the Verde River, spent a lot of time building trust with the irrigators. This is the, you know, the ditch boss, Frank Gaminden, you know, a lot of time spent talking. How do you use the water? How, you know, and then showed them how this technology, which is, you know, not rocket science, it's an automated head gate, solar powered, that allows the irrigators to take just the water they need and leave the rest for the river. Frank, who was ditch boss at the time this photo was taken, can manage this from a cell phone from his living room. He no longer has to get up at 2 in the morning and raise and lower the gates, so he's pretty happy with it. And the farmers that were last in line for the irrigation water are still getting the water they need. But as you can see here, some of the water is going back to the river. It's not all being diverted. And that spawned, you know, that belief that we can have, you know, a healthier river as well as enough irrigation water spawned some of the young farmers. Here's Zach Hauser, who has happened to be last in line for the drip system, excuse me, for the irrigation water. He decided to shift from flood to drip. And again, saving water and allowing some additional water to stay in the river. This fellow decided to create, in a sense, a market for barley. And if you think about how much water barley uses versus alfalfa, it uses not only less water, but it needs that water. Barley needs water earlier in the season. So you're tapping the river in the spring rather than in the summer when it's super dry. So he encouraged the shifting from alfalfa to barley, and then he himself helped to build a barley malting facility in the town so that there was a ready market for the barley that farmers knew would be there, created barley malt, which is supplying craft breweries in Arizona with an important input to their production. So one thing led to another. It began with trust, but it was all about getting smarter about how we use the water in this valley. And the amazing thing is there's really no downside to this that we've been able to see, right? It's a triple win. You've upgraded the irrigation, you've improved habitat, there's more recreation. So it's good for irrigators, good for the local economy, very good for the environment. And I would say that it's been an amazing collaboration in this restoration of the Verde that has included corporations, right? If you look down to Phoenix, REI, the recreational company, Coca-Cola had a plant in Phoenix. They're interested in being able to attract employees to their facilities. Well, they want good recreation opportunities, right? So this was, in addition to being good in the valley, was really good for companies that saw a benefit as well. And also they were investing in order to show that they are good water stewards. We're not only doing what we can to reduce our water use in our factories, we're actually helping give some water back to the natural environment. We are going above and beyond as water stewards. So there's a great collaboration here of on the ground conservation work, upgrading of irrigation, corporate water stewardship being exhibited. It's just really a great example, and it has become, in my mind, kind of a poster child for, for good river restoration, collaborative, creative work together, and it's had great benefits. Another thing we can do, and I have to admit to you that rebuilding soil health was not something on my radar screen as a water analyst and water researcher and writer for 30 years. I mean, I just did not really think about soil health as a water management strategy. So, bad on me, right? Because it took me a while to realize how important it was. Globally, you can see here, soils can hold 8 times as much water as all the world's rivers combined. But we rarely manage that soil reservoir. We don't think of it as a soil reservoir. In fact, I bet most of us, looking back to our 4th grade textbooks and the image, the diagram of the water cycle, soils was rarely shown, right? You would see rivers, you would see groundwater, but there was often no drawing of the soil that is also holding water. And what's happened is this critical reservoir of water has shrunk over time because, as you can see on the right, of deep plowing, of the kind of industrial scale agriculture that, again, has created a lot of benefits, but has not maintained the ecosystem services of the land. Among them, importantly, being the health of the soil. And you can see in that image of the soil on the left, how a healthy soil has an incredible amount of organic matter, porosity, that can allow you to hold that water. There's studies that have shown that for every 1% increase in carbon stored in the soil, you can get an extra 20,000 gallons of water stored in that soil. So it is an important reservoir. One thing we can do to improve soil health is cover cropping of the land. If you look back here, you can see there's nothing holding down the soil. It's exposed to wind and water erosion, especially in the off season when nothing is planted on it. But if you can plant a cover crop mix, again, with crops, these are crops that are best used in, say, an area like New York State, this winter cover crop mix, but different crops in different locations. But you get tremendous benefits from that. You're expanding that soil reservoir by building soil health. So you're getting mitigation of floods, mitigation of droughts. Farmers, if you include things like clover and nitrogen fixing plants, you don't have to use as much chemical fertilizer, saves money. For the farmer, you get fewer toxic algal blooms because you're not having as much nitrogen and phosphorus running off the land, and you're sequestering carbon, you're mitigating climate change. And the bad news, good news is we're only cover cropping about 6% of farmland in the US. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I want to say there's a new study out. I need to study that number, maybe a bit higher now. It's gone from 3% to 6% in the last, I think, 5 or 10 years. And so I want to look at the latest data, which I think just came out. But last I saw, it was about 6% of US farmland. Now in Maryland, and this is what's inspiring, which has been incentivizing the planting of cover crops, in part to help protect runoff help protect Chesapeake Bay from runoff. Maryland has been subsidizing cover crop seeds, so farmers are motivated to plant them. And there you see about 29% of the cropland is getting cover cropped. So again, with the right incentives, we can scale this up and get all of these benefits here in a more widespread area. So I think, as I learned more and more about the benefits of cover cropping, it looked like such a practical, important solution that's just waiting to be scaled up. Back to groundwater, again, that sleeping tiger. The Central Valley of California is the nation's fruit and vegetable bowl. It's lost about 80 million acre feet. Let me check this number real quick. Yeah, 80 million acre feet in half a century in that Central Valley groundwater system. So there's been, chronic depletion of groundwater, and then in drought years, much more depletion with not nearly enough replenishment. So there's been this long-term decline. And I want to say replenishing aquifers is absolutely critical to building resilience to climate change. During a drought, when rivers and reservoirs dry up, groundwater is your critical reserve. It's like your insurance policy. You want it to be there for you. But if we're depleting it in a chronic way and not replenishing it during the wet years, it's not going to be there for us in the way that we need it to have that resilience. And so California came late to the game, I would say, in terms of managing and regulating groundwater, but in 2014, it passed a groundwater law that aims for sustainability by 2040. So it's giving farmers, this was passed in 2014, we're already, 7 years into it, but by 2040, wanting more of a balance. So how are you going to do this? Certainly more efficient irrigation, maybe some crop switching and so on. Some agricultural land inevitably will come out of production during this process. But one creative solution that I found extremely interesting was using winter floodwaters when they occur to recharge the aquifers. You're going to have those very, very wet years when you have plenty of floodwater to, supply the ecosystems that are near the coast with the water that they're used to getting in the wintertime. And then you've got some extra. You had floodwaters going on. 2016 and 17 were years like that for California. So scientists, state officials began to mobilize quickly and work with farmers who were willing to experiment with flooding their orchards, their fields, with some of this winter floodwater. So this almond farmer who I visited when I was researching Replenish, this was in 2016, he decided to volunteer 5 of his acres of almond trees to this experiment because he saw that it was important for the long term. He was taking the long view and saw that you would get these benefits in this right-hand list here: banking water for the drier times, building drought resistance, reducing pumping costs. If your aquifer levels are coming up, your groundwater levels are coming up, you don't have to pump water from as deep, so you're reducing costs. Preserve the aquifer, reducing land subsidence, which has been a problem from aquifer depletion. And then future generations, we want the water to be there. So he signed on. And it was an experiment that involved scientists working with the farmers in the field, studying what's happening. I mean, this is a risky thing for a farmer to just flood a field like this. What's going to happen to the soil? What's going to happen to the trees, the roots? Are the trees going to be damaged? What's going to happen over time? And so it's a longer term experiment, but the initial few years suggested you're getting recharge. The nitrogen that's been put on the land is not contaminating the groundwater to a significant degree, and you're getting most of the benefits you're looking for. They're looking at this with orchards, with other kinds of field crops as well, and so far it seems to be a good solution. The numbers for California here you saw in 2017, 6.5 million acre feet went into local aquifers that otherwise might not have gotten them, right? This water is being delivered through existing infrastructure and then released to these fields. So this is active recharge in addition to the passive recharge from rain. So this is a good step forward. It's not going to solve the problem. The estimates are that this could cut the groundwater deficit in the Central Valley by 1/4. So it's not a silver bullet, but that's a significant chunk of the problem that might be solved in these wet years. You can't do this every year. It's not this wet every year in the wintertime. But when you can, mobilize to do it and be prepared. And the other thing is it's cost effective. When you look at groundwater recharge compared to building a new reservoir or expanding a reservoir to saltwater, seawater desalination, the range of costs, it tends to be lower. So you're doing this in a cost-effective way. It's less damaging to the environment than these other two solutions. So a good thing to look at. And there's various ways of doing groundwater recharges. I'm sure many of you know, but probably an underutilized solution. Okay, a few more things before we open up to questions. So I'm going to turn a little bit more to cities and the urban environments now, and talk a bit about what's going on in watersheds and urban areas. In general, we've invested, I think, too little, much too little in watershed protection. Watersheds are the source of our drinking water. This is where our water originates, but we often have not thought about that as an important part of the water cycle to protect. So we've gone about, housing developments and so on in critical watershed areas. New York City took a different approach to this and did it in time. New York City gets 90% of its drinking water from the Catskills, Delaware watershed. A number of reservoirs, you can see one here, the Ashokan Reservoir is one of a number that New York City relies on. And back in the mid-90s, New York City decided to start investing in the protection and conservation of its watershed. And the reason this is important is that, EPA requires that if you are a water utility getting drinking water from a surface water source, a river, a reservoir, a lake, you need to have a filtration plant, unless you can show that your watershed protection is good enough to not need one. For most city utilities, the train has already left the station there. There's not an opportunity to do that because the watershed is sort of already too developed. You can make it better, but it's gonna be hard to avoid the filtration plant. But New York City got in early, and it was not easy. It required an enormous amount of cooperation, collaboration, working with cities and towns, mostly towns, in the watershed, forestry companies, farmers. So a lot of work, and it was difficult, but the upshot is so far a successful model where 37.5% of the watershed is protected from development. And one of the things New York did was pay property taxes. It didn't have to, but pay property taxes, in these towns so that they weren't hit by, a budget crisis from New York, basically taking this land and conserving it. So they help to make it right economically, upgrading septic systems and treatment plants, and then controlling erosion in forests and stream through forest and stream projects in the watershed. So with an investment of 1.7 billion, so far, New York has avoided the need to construct a $10 billion filtration plant that would cost several $100 million a year to run and operate and maintain. So it's been incredibly cost effective. It's continued to protect the watershed. And again, it was difficult to get there, but so far it has worked. And it's a great model. This is a city of 8 million people. And it's rare to find an example that's quite as striking. We have Seattle doing some of this, both Portland, Oregon, Portland, Maine doing some of this kind of work. But I'm quite taken with what New York has done. I mentioned again that we're seeing a lot more pollution from non-point sources and the growth of algal blooms around the country. So one thing that's fairly new on the horizon is this ability to incentivize what might be called next generation septic systems to protect both groundwater quality, surface water quality, and prevent algal blooms from occurring. This is one of those advanced systems, and they're very similar to traditional septic systems, but as you can see, they include an extra chamber that involves a community of microbes in that chamber eating the nitrogen in the waste stream. You can think of it kind of like nature in a box. What wetlands are doing in the natural world, this septic system is mimicking in this box of the septic system. These advanced systems can generally reduce nitrogen by about half or more. And so in places that are dealing with this influx of nitrogen causing algal blooms, causing dead zones, they're of increasing interest. One of those areas is Suffolk County, Long Island. I actually grew up here in Nassau County, further west toward New York City. But Suffolk County, as you can see, is suffering big time from the effect of nitrogen pollution getting into its groundwater, into its rivers and streams, and out to its coastal zones. These are very important areas for commercial fisheries, clamming, oysters, and I'm not sure if you can read this, but this map is showing areas of highest priority in red, second highest priority in yellow, and then the blue, also a priority, but a bit less so. So they've mapped out where the priority areas are, and then said, you know, Suffolk County and New York State would like to incentivize the installation of these advanced treatment systems by offering grants of up to $30,000 to qualified property owners. And so this system is underway. I mean, some other systems are still being demonstrated to get approval, but there are a couple that I think have qualified for homeowners to install. And so, you know, this is sort of trying to get ahead of the game. Suffolk County has, I should have mentioned this, Suffolk County has the densest population of septic systems of anywhere in the country. This is overall here a population of about, I think, 1.5 million people. And especially as you get further east, much of these properties are the wastewater is treated with either cesspools or the old septic systems, which do not take the nitrogen out. So this is, again, a problem throughout the East Coast. Some of you may be living in areas where this is a problem, where you're trying a solution like this or a different one. I hope we can talk about that a little more in the Q&A, and maybe you can share your experience. The other thing that's important to do, and I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly soon to get to questions, is this idea of just building water resilience, right? We need to do this, especially with climate change. This statistic is interesting. Cities annually import a volume of water equivalent to 10 Colorado rivers. This is the California aqueduct, bringing water from Northern California to Southern California. But increasingly, cities that are dependent on water coming from elsewhere are having to wonder, is that water going to be there? If you look at Phoenix and its long-term water plan, Phoenix is no longer assuming that the 40% of its water supply that comes from the Colorado River is going to be there in the future. The Colorado, we know from climate work, climate science work, is going to shrink. The volume of water in the Colorado system is going to go down 35%, 50% over this century. Arizona's last in line for that water by virtue of the treaty and how it was set up. And the law of the river, and so it's having to become resilient and not depend on that water. Conservation has done a lot of good in this country, and we rarely think about it. But between 2000 and 2015 only, we've seen domestic water use go down 18%. What's amazing about conservation is we rarely even need to think about it, and the reason is that the U.S. passed in 1992, as part of the Energy Policy Act, water efficiency standards that required that plumbing manufacturers, so the makers of toilets, faucets, and shower heads, build efficiency into their products. So when I was a kid, it took 5 gallons to flush a toilet. Now you cannot buy a toilet that takes more than 1.6 gallons to flush. So we're building conservation into our homes, new major remodels, into our schools, into our offices as a result. And so without even really thinking about any behavior change, we're on a per capita basis using less water. And the other thing is this WaterSense, EPA's WaterSense program, which is like a voluntary labeling program. If you go out to buy a new shower head or faucet, you can know by this label that it's a water efficient fixture. So when you add this up, we are now saving nationwide 9 billion, that's with a B, 9 billion gallons of water a day as a result of these conservation measures. That's equivalent to 9 New York Cities worth of water that we're saving. And so it's an incredible amount of water, and it means water that can remain in a river, remain in a lake. One of the stories I liked early on was Boston, which, you know, a typical problem that utilities have, you know, we're above our safe yield, we need to look for more water. That was the thinking, right? Do what we were doing before, but do it bigger, do it more. So they started looking at, the utility started looking at a diversion from the Connecticut River in Western Massachusetts. Well, the conservation groups were concerned. What about, you know, the Atlantic salmon fishery in the Connecticut? It's going to get damaged and so on. And so they forced a look at conservation. And this was very early. We're talking mid-'80s. And so even before the national efficiency standards came in here in the early 90s, Boston turned to conservation, education, pricing, retrofitting homes with efficient fixtures, and water use system-wide came way, way down. Today, water use in Greater Boston is 40% of what it was at the peak and back where it was 50 years ago. This is not per capita, this is system-wide. It's an amazing story. And so you have the Connecticut River remaining a very, very healthy river. And the conservation work cost far less than it would have to divert water from the Connecticut. So beneficial from an economic standpoint and an ecological standpoint. We have a lot more to do, especially in the West, in outdoor conservation, native plants, getting rid of the thirsty green lawns. Some utilities are implementing this with cash for grass programs, paying for taking thirsty grass out and putting in native landscaping. A lot more we can do there. I'm sure many of you are involved in this kind of work, helping rain infiltrate the earth in our urban and suburban areas. This is, I think, a wide open field, tremendous creativity and landscape architecture that can go into this. EPA supports this with different programs, and I'm sure many of you know a lot about it, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But I think this is just a tremendous opening for flood control, turning stormwater from a nuisance to an asset, dealing with our problems of combined stormwater and sewer overflows that is so prevalent, particularly in the East and Midwest, through helping rain infiltrate the earth with green infrastructure, rain gardens, vegetated swales. You can see here, this is a depression here between the sidewalk and the road that's going to capture and help that rain infiltrate. Green roofs, permeable pavement. I think someone contacted us before this session talking about the use of permeable pavement, and I've seen this in a few areas. It's I think going to be a growing solution as well. If you're interested in a national approach to this, take a look at what China's doing. The president of China a few years back initiated what he called a sponge cities initiative with a goal of retaining 70% of the urban areas stormwater in place, right? Retain 70% of that stormwater, piloting it in 30 cities, again, with an intention of building resilience to intense floods and droughts. China, perhaps more than any country, has this flip-flop going of intense flooding in its urban areas, followed by intense droughts. And so building that resilience is critical. So I'm going to end with this slide and then open up for questions. We have, Los Angeles as an interesting case study going forward in this resilience building with a goal, public goal of cutting water imports by 50%. I think, as most of us know, LA gets a significant amount of its water from not only Northern California, but from the Colorado River Basin. So cutting its water imports by half to build water security and build resilience. And it's going to try to do it through all of the measures we've been talking about: conservation, wastewater recycling, wastewater reuse, stormwater capture, and groundwater recharge. I actually didn't get a chance to talk too much about these just for lack of time, but that's part of it as well. Wow, so with that, I hope I didn't talk too much, too long, and overload you with information, but that's all I got right now. So again, more of these stories, I think all the ones I presented and more are in Replenish with more detail. If you're interested, please consider getting the book for more and write to me if you have additional questions. I'd be happy to answer your questions, but I think now I'm going to turn it back to Michael and take your questions. So thank you so much for listening.
Great, thanks, Sandra. And thanks to everybody who has sent questions in. We've gotten a good number of them already. You can see her website there if you want to contact her directly. So we'll just start, I think, with a more broad question here that we received during your presentation, Sandra, which is where does, and if you can turn on your webcam so folks can see you while we do the Q&A, that would be awesome.
Okay, let me do that.
I'll let you click on that while we get ready for questions. And thank you, great. And folks, we'll go to about 2:30 Eastern time. I know Sandra's in Mountain time right now, so it'll be a couple hours before that for her. So here's the question. Where does the water go? It doesn't evaporate off into space, correct? So it must still be here on the planet, but just in less of a desirable quality, or is it located in the wrong places?
That's a great question, and you're right. Pretty much the water's here, and so where does it go? And this it's a very good question. And so we're concerned with water that we can actually access, right? What's accessible for us to use. And so when I was talking about how with a warming atmosphere, that atmosphere is expanding, which means it can hold more water. So some of the water that would otherwise be in the soil or in a reservoir is instead up in the atmosphere. Now, if you're in a wet area, that's probably going to condense and create more intense rain. And so you're going to experience that change as more intense rainstorms, as we're seeing. Look at Nashville, right now, and many other examples. If you're in a dry area, we call it the evaporative demand of the atmosphere. That is increasing. So the atmosphere wants more water, and it's going to take it out of the soil, it's going to take it out of reservoirs, but it may not reach the point where it's going to condense and fall as rain. So you have more water in storage in the atmosphere that may not be creating rain for you. So the water is still there, it's in a different state and in a different place. And so that's sort of the key change. Water is constantly cycling at different scales, both time scales and spatial scales. We have a little water cycle in our backyard garden, right? You water and it sits there and recharges the soil, and then the crops transpire that water back to the atmosphere. And that's a little water cycle in our garden. And then we have, regional water cycles in each watershed. And then we have, national and global. And so we can think of it on many scales. And it's a great question because it's fascinating to really think about where the water is going. I hope I answered that well enough for you for now.
Thanks, I think so. Next question is from Andrea Tuning, who's asking, our community is currently rewriting our zoning code. What are some of the best regulations that we can introduce to help protect our watershed?
Wow, and where is Andrea living? Where's the watershed?
That I don't know, but
okay.
If you can respond, I'll tell you. Andrea, if you can just put some questions down.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I hesitate to be very specific without knowing what watershed you're in and what the critical issues are there. So, in general, when I think about watershed protection, I think about one, protecting forests. So if you're in a watershed where there are natural forests in the source area for the drinking water supply, protecting what's there is important. We've seen studies that show, you get higher quality drinking water with percentage increases in the percentage of your watershed in forest, right? So nature's doing some of the treatment for you. So if that's an option, protecting watersheds protecting forests is important. In terms of, again, I hesitate to get specific about codes and regulations without knowing what the issues are. One of the things we're seeing in the West is increasing concern about resilience to fire. And so in the Rio Grande watershed where I live, we have a community sort of statewide initiative called the Rio Grande Water Fund. This is not so much a regulation as an incentive to try to rehabilitate 600,000 acres of the Rio Grande watershed in critical places to make it more resilient to fire, to make the likelihood of a mega fire breaking out reduce. Because we had a fire a few years ago that required that Albuquerque and Santa Fe shut down their water intake because there was so much debris coming out of the watershed, so much sediment, blackened wood and so on, that was going to gunk up all the water treatment systems. So they shut down the water intake, turned to groundwater as their secondary source until the watershed could clear. And so I think, again, watershed protection, rehabilitation, I think are things that should be on our radar screen. I think housing density, looking at the kind of plantings that are done. These are all opportunities, I think, to encourage a more healthy water cycle at our local and regional scales.
Thanks, Sandra. I don't know if you want to add to it, but she said she's from Boise.
Oh, Boise. I love Boise. It's a nice, really nice city. Well, I think some of those things I talked about are very relevant. Certainly building fire resilience in the watershed. Beautiful watershed that Boise is situated in. Protecting forested areas to preserve the quality of water. Yeah, I think without knowing the specifics of Boise's drinking water situation and housing density situation, I think that's about the best I can say.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Brian Hummel, who says, that was an amazing presentation. Do you have any examples you can share where farmers are improving soil health to increase infiltration rates and mitigate drought and flooding concurrently?
Yeah, and thank you for that. Again, I think the cover cropping example is still a great one. I have in my book a wonderful example of a farmer actually in North Dakota who found himself, dealing with the effects of drought and realizing that, his production was suffering. He was not, able to continue, feeling productive and profitable as a farmer in that drought situation, and basically completely converted his production process to more what we call regenerative agriculture, working on using cover crops, using animals to help create better soil health. And I didn't have a chance to talk about that, but there's a whole emerging area in that field as well. And so it's just a great story, and I encourage you to read about it. But basically, he dramatically reduced his use of chemical fertilizer, improved infiltration rates into the soil, so the soil itself was expanding as a reservoir, made his land more resilient to drought and floods as well, because you're able to capture and store more water. And so he found himself more profitable on a net basis, using less fertilizer, and had a more holistic, more regenerative system. His name is Gabe Brown. He's become quite a spokesperson nationally for regenerative agriculture. And again, from North Dakota, had been a very conventional farmer before that, but he just saw the benefits. So this, and again, the great thing about these solutions is they can be scaled. They're not a one size fits all, but looking at the conditions in different locations and adapting what's working in other places and then scaling them up. We have a farm bill coming up in 2023, where there might be an opportunity, to begin to incentivize some of these practices. Farmers are great business people, right? They need to make a profit, and so they will respond to incentives just like any good business person does. So I think creating those incentives and opportunities would allow some of these solutions to begin to scale. I remember a couple of years ago we had, I guess it was in 2018, 2019, tremendous flooding throughout the Midwest, from Iowa all the way across, Kansas. The images were just startling, the number of farms and farm houses underwater. And this again is something we need to prepare for. And soil health, while it may not solve that problem, is going to help, because rather than running off the field, that water is going to be able to recharge a bit more. So I'm very, optimistic about the potential for these kinds of solutions. So again, I speak about this having overlooked soil too much myself for 30 years, and now I see, wow, there's a great opportunity here that has, again, multiple benefits. And again, we'll be mitigating climate change too. When you put carbon in the soil, you're putting carbon in that would otherwise be in the atmosphere. So multiple benefits. And that's, to me, those are the kinds of solutions we need. Solving our water challenges, our climate challenges, our biodiversity challenges at the same time. And these solutions that work to repair and replenish ecosystems, that work kind of with nature rather than against it, if you will, do exactly that. They're solving multiple problems at the same time. You know, think about reconnecting a river to its floodplain. Instead of making the levees higher, think about giving the river some of its floodplain back. Wow, I mean, you're recharging groundwater, you're creating habitat, you're putting carbon in the soil because you're creating wetlands. I mean, these are great solutions, exciting solutions that we can tap more as we look, you know, to building resilience.
Great, thanks. That was a great answer. Next question here is from Catherine Fletcher, who says she's in Western Massachusetts and is asking, where can we get support with specific watershed needs?
Where can we get support with specific watershed needs?
Yes, I think they're looking for, like you were talking earlier, if they're looking in a certain area, are there specific resources that they can have access to, or how would you recommend they begin?
Yeah. I used to live in Western Massachusetts. I absolutely love Western Massachusetts. So it's a good question. You know, I think reach out to an organization like Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, which I think does a great job of connecting the watershed and river community in Massachusetts to resources and information about what's available. You know, there's just so much good happening in Massachusetts in terms of restoration work. I'm not sure exactly what your question entails. You know, the Connecticut River has a watershed group. So, you know, I think, you know, reach out to some of those key organizations and see what the resources are. And of course, EPA has various programs depending on what the desire and need is and what the organization is. So again, I don't want to get too specific and get it wrong, but I think there's a lot of good opportunity there for resources. I love that area of the country, and there's a lot of good resource protection and restoration work going on. So keep up the good work out there.
Great, thanks, Sandra. And thanks again to everybody who's sending in all these questions. We really have a lot to we may want to go over an extra 5 minutes. We'll see where we are, Sandra, if you have a few more minutes, just given the volume of questions that we received.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. Here's the next question is, please ask Sandra to discuss household water consumption in cities and how to plan for greater reduction in recycling at the household level. What can we do there?
Great question. So I would say, again, we've done a really good job in building conservation into our homes and offices. It's been a great success story, but we can definitely do more. You know, I think anytime you're replacing a major appliance, you know, a dishwasher, a washing machine, toilets, you know, that the appliances and fixtures that use the most water in the home, you know, use that water sense label to guide you in choosing a water efficient fixture or appliance. So that's basic level. Think about outdoor water use more. We can almost all do better outdoors. You know, if you're living in the West, usually half or more of your household water use is water that's being used outdoors. So, you know, getting away from the very thirsty, you know, bluegrass, green lawns, particularly in the West, would be a big part of this solution. And again, utilities are promoting it, but we still have quite a ways to go. I think really the new frontier in the Western US is really dealing with that outdoor water use. You know, in some places we're beginning to see, you know, the double piping. So you're receiving drinking quality water for all the drinking water type needs, showering, cooking, obviously drinking, but then using what we call, gray water or secondarily treated water for outdoor water use. That's not terribly widespread yet, but it is an option. I've seen community scale systems where, for example, where communities have the wastewater, the treated wastewater, so secondarily or tertiarily treated wastewater irrigating, the outdoor spaces in the community, golf courses, parks, this kind of thing. So that's becoming increasingly common. That's quite common now in California, for example. You can see that many, many times. So those are some of the things that that come to mind. I mean, it's amazing during a drought, and California experienced this a few years ago. California's done a pretty good job at conservation. Cities like LA, their water demand is way, way down. But when they went through that 5-year drought between 2012 to 2016, I think it was, there was an additional 25% reduction in household water use in many cases. And so there's still a lot you can squeeze out if you need to, if you want to. You can collect water while you're showering, right, and water your plants with it if it doesn't have too much soap in it, and things like that. So there's a lot we can do at the individual household level. And while we're on this question of individual use, the one thing I didn't talk about at all is we have a lot of choices as individuals too. If we think about our personal water footprint, only 5 or 10% of that is at home, right, is our home water use. The rest of it is our diets, our energy use, and the things we buy every day, computers and clothes and, everything else. And so if we personally want to make a difference, we can take a look at our water footprint and see where we want to do better. Diet for most Americans, let me just give you this number. If you were an average American, your water footprint is about 2,000 gallons a day, even though you're only maybe using 100 gallons a day at home, right? Maybe some places a lot less. So the other is your diet and your energy and your material consumption. Half of that 2,000 is your diet for the average American. So you can make some choices. And again, this is not to make us feel guilty. It's just to make us feel that we can, if we choose, be part of the solution. Just shrink our personal water footprint. That's something we can all do. And if we multiply that by, tens of millions of people, it can make a difference. So I just wanted to add that, since I didn't talk about that during my presentation, because some people do want to know, what can I personally do? And what can my community do, and my family? And so they're at every level we can get educated and make different choices if we choose to, which I think is a good thing.
Thanks, Sandra. Actually, it's interesting because I think this question is somewhat related, and I was getting ready to ask you it before you added to your other response. And this is from Andrew Gray, who's asking, how does one guard against the rebound effect, that is, water conservation leading to an even greater amount of water being used than before the implementation of the water conservation? Is that something you've seen happen, or we have to plan for?
I'm not sure. Is it Andrew? I'm not sure what he's referring to. I think I need a little more information about the question. Does that mean, I'm not sure whether it's referring to, you have a water efficient toilet, you have to flush it more often, which typically is not the case. Sometimes you have irrigation sensors in your backyard. They're not programmed properly. You're watering when it's raining or whatever. I'm not exactly sure what the question is. When conservation leads to more water use. I think I need a little more information. So maybe we can come back, if he can expand on what he means in the question, and then we can come back to it in a second. That might be good to do.
Okay, yeah, he just sent a link to an article, but I don't have a chance to open it up right now. So maybe we'll just table that one for now.
Okay.
Okay, let me go back up here. So I was looking for response. Do you have any advice for recent graduates who are interested in entering the water sector, what they should think about and kind of plan their careers around from an early standpoint?
Oh gosh, great. We need you. So I'm glad that this question has come up. You know, it really depends. The wonderful thing about water, one of the many wonderful things about water is that it's incredibly interdisciplinary, right? You can work on the water challenges we've been exploring together today from an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, from an ecological standpoint. You can cross and become an eco-engineer. So it really, I think, depends on how you see your niche in this space. And by niche, I think I mean, you know, what you love to do. Do you love to design things? Do you love to build things with what you're good at? What do you love to do? What are you good at? How does that merge around water? I think I love when I see architects, who are interested in being part of the water solution, apply their architectural skills, to green infrastructure and making a beautiful place more water conserving at the same time, So I think it's a great thing about water, and we need it in all these areas. So again, I feel like I've said this a lot today, without knowing the specifics of what your particular skills are, what your particular interests and loves are, it's hard to recommend something. But the good thing is there's a need for it all in water. Planning, obviously. I studied geology in college. I studied resource economics in grad school. I studied environmental management in grad school. It was a very interdisciplinary background, and little did I know, sort of a perfect one for working on water, which I didn't know I was going to work on until right after grad school, but I was sort of ready for it. And for me, it served me well, wanting to take this broad view of water challenges, and I love to write, so I worked on communicating about them. And so that's kind of how I found my niche early on. So anyway, hats off to you for taking water as your your interest and where you want to put your energy and your passion and your skills. So I thank you for that, and I'm sure you'll find it.
Thanks, Sandra. Next question here is from Amanda Beck, who's asking, do you have any recommendations for political stagnation? I previously worked as an urban planner in the Phoenix metro area, and I can tell you that the local governments in the valley aren't recognizing that their drinking water supply is in danger. So it's hard to make decision makers take meaningful action. What can we do?
That is a great question. Yeah. There's a strong tendency we all have to be in denial about things that are hard to accept, hard to grasp. That's a place we all go when we're confronted with tough things, and I think it applies to our cities and our governments and our businesses and everybody right now, that we sort of don't want to believe what's coming, and yet in a certain way we know what's coming. So I think just talking about this, having these conversations, recognizing the future that's coming. It's very hard to take these numbers and understand what they mean. I mean, Phoenix is a great example where Phoenix depends, as I mentioned, I think during the presentation, 40% of Phoenix's water comes from the Colorado River. It's brought in by a major diversion, the Central Arizona Project. That goes on down to Tucson and supplies Tucson also. It was built in the 1960s, before we really recognized what climate change was going to do. It's virtually accepted now that the Colorado River is going to have significantly less water. Exactly how much we don't know, but it is substantial, right? Maybe as much as 35% less in the coming decades. And so by virtue of the agreements that the 7 Colorado River Basin states have made, and the agreement that Arizona made when it wanted the federal government to subsidize the building of the Central Arizona project, Arizona gets water last. So California gets all of its water from the Colorado River before Arizona gets any. So that's a resilience problem, right? And yet it's hard to grapple with. And yet the water planners that I'm familiar with in Phoenix, and maybe this is a different time than you were there, but I've seen, Karen Sorensen, who, is very much involved in this planning effort in Arizona. I've seen her quoted as saying, we need to plan for not necessarily having that 40% of our water that's coming from the Colorado River. So we need to double down on other solutions. But you're right. It takes a while to really wake up to these challenges and think differently, and then begin to act to build this. I think we're seeing it. It's taken a while, but just in the last few years, I think we're starting to see more areas really take on this challenge in a real way. But your point is very well taken, and I think just having these conversations is critical, and then bringing them up to the governmental level, to the decision-making level, and keeping reality as we can see it, as clear as we can, front and center, and just really trying to avoid the tendency to go into these states of denial, I think is really key. I'm not sure if that answered your question satisfyingly, but that's kind of what I think right now.
Understood. So we'll ask a couple more and then we'll wrap up. And I guess following on what you were saying about what we can do as individuals, we got a question from Louise Armont, who's asking, I try to empty my used dishwasher out in the garden or the lawn, or on my fruit trees. Is this worth the effort, and how useful are rain barrels?
Wow. I don't know about emptying emptying the dishwasher. I've never thought of that. Most dishwashers go right into your, anyway. Yeah, I'm not sure, and I don't know the quality of that water. I haven't studied that question, so I don't know if that's useful to do. But rain barrels, I think rain barrels can be very useful. There's some controversy around rain barrels because, particularly in the West, where like every drop is allocated, right? There's some question of whose rain is it? Can I capture that rain if I don't have a water right to that rain? And we're starting to work that out. Colorado, had that question circulating for quite a while. I live in New Mexico now, and much of the rain that comes down, depending on where you live in New Mexico, would otherwise evaporate, right? It's going to hit the ground and it's going to evaporate and not do too much to support vegetation. If you have a garden, rather than watering from scarce groundwater or scarce river water, I think it can make sense to capture that rainwater and use that rainwater, to irrigate hopefully a native landscape that doesn't need a lot of water anyway, but needs some. So I think depending on where it is, rain barrels and capturing rain and using it wisely for irrigating a garden can make a good difference. And I think a lot of communities are doing that. There's some great examples. I think of all the cities I can think of, Tucson, Arizona, has been an early adopter of the use of rain barrels and rain gardens. So I encourage you to look at what Tucson is doing. There's a great book out. Wish I could remember the title of it. But if you kind of, just Google rain barrels, rain gardens, Tucson, I have a feeling this will come up. It's a really terrific book about the use of rain barrels and rain gardens in a desert environment.
Okay, thank you. I guess our last question for today is from Katie Norris. I'm kind of looking it forward. Do you think all of this is enough and happening quickly enough? These solutions are exciting and are happening, but in the race against climate change, are we winning the race?
No, and that's what keeps me up. Replenish is probably the most optimistic book I've written, even though the trends have gotten worse over the decades, because I was looking for examples, real world examples on the ground that showed we can repair the water cycle and have good prosperity at the same time. And they're out there. Those examples are out there. So that's what gives me a kind of realistic optimism. Where I get down, what gives me despair is that we're moving way too slow. And I think not just about climate change, but I have a deep affinity for the natural world and what's happening to natural ecosystems and what's happening to life. The numbers I presented to you on fish, and then we could add birds and insects and so on. The web of life is fraying. So it's an all hands on deck time in my view. And we do need to pick up the pace. So I think, these practices that are working need to get turned into incentives to scale them, policies to scale them, an ethic that society adopts that says we need to, provide all living things with enough water so that the web of life can survive and continue. And we're part of that web of life. So yes, I share your concern about the timing completely. And that's really what keeps me up at night is that we need to really, really pick up the pace. That's a great last question, so I thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we could keep going on and on. We got many more questions than we will have time for, but just wondering if you have any kind of closing thoughts for us, takeaways based on everything that you shared today.
I think that last question kind of, in a way, sums it up for me. But the thing that I'm realizing from these questions and following on what I communicated today is the great thing about water is we can all be involved in some way, at the personal level, in our jobs, whether we're at a company or with a local or state government agency, as a planner, as a concerned citizen working in a community. We can all get involved. And if we're going to scale these things up and we're going to pick up the pace, that really is what it's going to take. So it's a great thing about water that, we can all engage and we can all get involved and we can all make a difference. And working together, I do have optimism that we can turn some of these trends around.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate your time and the great session.
No, thank you all. Thank you, Michael. And again, thank you, Jen. And thank you, John, for all your behind the scenes work. And I really want to thank you all for taking an hour and a half out of your day to think with me about water. And I really appreciate that very much and wish you all the very, very best.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. With that, we'll conclude our webinar today, Replenish, Supporting the Virtuous Cycle of Water and Prosperity. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Sandra Postel for a great presentation, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including 2 upcoming programs that have already been scheduled, including the Future of Mobility, What's Next for American Cities with the Congress for the New Urbanism on April 9th, and a new approach to parks and recreation system planning on April 16th. Have a great day. Thanks for participating.